So, what's the value of graphic or gruesome imagery in film? You know what I'm talking about, the sort of stuff that makes you go, I'm going to read a book now. What I'm talking about here isn't necessarily shocking imagery, as that can include totally benign on-screen content that shocks us as an audience because of its context. Shocking imagery could just be the protagonist holding hands with the wrong man or woman. More specifically than that, I'm talking about images that are shocking because of their graphic nature. Images of sex or violence. While sex on film may have existed since the 1920s, eroticism and sexual imagery has existed since the 1896 film La Cochère de la Mariée, which features a striptease, ooh la la. Whilst graphic sexual imagery, as we as a modern audience would know it, didn't exist since the dawn of film. Violence has existed in film for almost as long as film itself. The Great Train Robbery has a number of shootouts, as you'd expect. I suppose you might argue that Georg Méliès's A Trip to the Moon has a bit of graphic imagery too, what with the moon taking a rocket to the face. Birth of a Nation is somewhat more graphic, and Murderers in the Rue Morgue, despite being pre-code, was cut by Universal from its original runtime of 80 minutes to 61 because of its graphic nature. All of these films depict violence. Well, maybe not A Trip to the Moon, but I don't think any of them, in their depiction of violence, would at all be called graphic by a modern audience. Murders in the Rue Morgue is interesting because it does convey quite a sense of threat in some of its scenes, and this was no doubt shocking at the time, but really that's all down to the tone of the film. The Great Train Robbery, with all its gunplay, is much more fun. But there's no 12-minute rape scene, no one has to cut off their own hand with a rusty saw, there's no appendages bursting from someone's chest. I mean, I haven't seen the director's cut. I think to an extent, there is a law of diminishing returns when it comes to on-screen violence. Island of Lost Souls, made in 1932, was later cut to pieces by censors after the introduction of the United States Motion Picture Production Code in 1934. In the UK it was banned, and then later it was given an X rating. Now it has a PG rating. Now I think it's fair to say that in 80 years' time, it's pretty unlikely that someone's going to be sat with their kids watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and saying, "Can you believe people used to think that this was graphic? How quaint." I think that the violence of a cowboy shooting another cowboy in a spaghetti western has become normalised, but I don't think that the violence in something like Drive ever will be. I think that the violence in Drive will always have some impact. Check out this clip from Chien, Andalou. So I think in terms of graphic violence on screen, although it may have become normalised over time, I think now we're on a bit of a plateau. There's obviously a bit of a spike every now and then, such as a Serbian film or Human Centipede 2, but they are seen as anomalies, they are seen as being particularly extreme, they're not normal. It was the rise of exploitation films and changes in society in the 1960s and 70s that ushered in a new era of on-screen nastiness. Now in the past, a necessity, not only for reasons of censorship, but also practicality, was suggestion. This method, which is really the opposite of graphic violence, has been used throughout film. Of course, in Reservoir Dogs, we do see the graphic aftermath. Not the violence itself, that's just implied. There are a number of reasons for doing this. Budgetary concerns, maybe the film wants to achieve a certain rating, but also it does have a certain effect. Maybe the most horrific things are things we don't see. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a great example of a very graphic film which still employs this technique. The door is closed and we can only imagine what happens next. I'd kind of describe the first Rambo film as an aftermath of just that. The thing that broke John Rambo, the unseen but omnipresent Vietnam War, isn't depicted. We only get to see the effects of its horror. But in other ways, on-screen graphic violence can help sell a point where only implying it may seem cheap. I think a big part of Alien's success with its famous chestburster scene is when you see it come out of John Hurt. That's about impact, something I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But first, I want to talk about how graphic imagery in films can help them emphasize their meaning. In The Passion of the Christ, the director, Mel Gibson, clearly wanted to make a point about Christ's suffering. He was trying to convey a serious message with the imagery he used, and the gruesomeness of some of the film's scenes are to emphasize that message. SHORTBUS uses sexual imagery to comment on sex and the place of sex in film. It deliberately depicts real sex, but it deliberately de-eroticizes it too. I think the makers of SHORTBUS would argue that for SHORTBUS to explore sex in the way that it wants to, it's necessary to show graphic scenes of sex. I really couldn't show you any clips from it.
Oh, for a minute I thought that man didn't have an arm.
The bloody, viscera-filled Omaha Beach D-Day assault in Saving Private Ryan was meticulously created to be accurate, not to shy away from the reality of warfare, but also not to be bloody to the point of gratuity. The bloodiness of Saving Private Ryan is no doubt there partly to make an interesting and memorable sequence, again to make an impact. But it's also there to offer realism and to highlight the sacrifices made by soldiers, and to show just how not like a walk in the park World War II was, unless that park is a minefield. Equally in this vein, there's Come and See, which I'll talk about more later in this video. However, like Saving Private Ryan, its graphic violence is part of its message. The director, Elem Klimov, wanted to show not only that there was a systematic genocide in Belarus, where the film is set, but what that actually means. Diametrically opposite to these films are films which don't use graphic imagery to emphasize a message or make a point, but as their key attraction. Like the previous category, violence is necessary for their point, but unlike something like Salo, which is a modern and very political adaptation of the Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom, the inclusion of violence isn't about enhancing or flavouring a meaning. Some people will go and see a film just for its graphic nature. Salo uses violent and sexual imagery to make political and philosophical points, but I think a good portion of people discovered it and maybe watched it because it has a reputation for being so full on. That's how I found it. Salo's graphic imagery has meaning, but I think also it's the film's unique selling point. I don't think I'm doing the Saw series a disservice to say it isn't trying to make a point. It isn't trying to be artistic or political. It's trying to entertain, and a large part of its entertainment value is for its graphic violence. People like watching violence, because it's not real, because it's escapism. Someone cutting off their own hand, or having to undergo some torturous event to escape something, that's interesting, that's engaging. It's shocking, but it's kind of fun. Cannibal Holocaust has very little in terms of story, or characters, or tension. But I watched it because of its reputation. The brutality of its imagery is the only noteworthy thing about it. And it kind of makes it watchable, at the same time as being unwatchable. Torture porn is distinctly different from other films that contain graphic and gruesome violent imagery, in that torture porn or modern splatter or video nasties essentially films where the intended main attraction for the audience is watching people try to escape peril, who instead, usually, find their way to a grisly death, are entirely cynical. But that's not necessarily a criticism of it. I don't see why a Final Destination film, where we know that a handful of adolescents or young adults are going to be deaded in unusual and exciting ways, is any more cynical than a rom-com, where we know that two people are going to meet, get off to a rocky start, and fall in love. These films might lack artistic value if they have no deeper meaning, but they're blatantly sold on being valuable for their spectacle. But again, I say that with the caveat that not all movies exploiting violence in this way don't have other value. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is part of this genre, and yes, it may be exploiting violence, but it's also terrifying. It's a movie that has more than just blood and guts. It has a real sense of menace and horror. Of course, it's the exploitative works that cast the use of graphic imagery in a bad light. But I think, arguably, it really comes down to the image used and how. But even then, when violence is used exploitatively, violence for the sake of violence, it is tapping into something. Pornography, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, does serve a purpose, and I think the same could be said about violent imagery too. I think the number of gruesome zombie movies, where we see the undead killed in every which way, is part of a weird desire people have to see things get decapitated or skewered or torn apart. Is serving that desire not valuable? If to no one else, then those who have it. So you have your films where the graphic imagery adds or is important to meaning. You have films where that is the attraction. And you have a hell of a lot of films where graphic imagery isn't necessarily used to convey meaning, but to add weighty resonance. Irreversible features a single-take rape scene. It could have been inferred, but whether it adds to the film narratively or not, it has an impact. It's uncomfortable, tragic, and perhaps most importantly, because it's so long, it's torturous. We don't see the highlights, we have to endure it too. Again with Alien, probably if we had only seen the crew's reaction to the chest burster, rather than it coming out of John Hurt's body, the impact would have been lessened. Maybe David Cronenberg could have just used silhouettes or narrated medical reports to keep us up to date with the evolution of Brundlefly. But seeing its grotesque dominance is so much more interesting and entertaining, and it allows us to connect with the metamorphosing character on a nothing else but I'm glad that isn't me sort of level. The depiction of violence in Blue Ruin may not be necessary to the story. I'm sure there was a way of doing it and making it a PG-13, but it's integral to the tone of the film, just like something like American Psycho. And the right graphic image can make all the difference and have a real impact on the audience. Back to Come and See, which deliberately starts off slowly. Our protagonist leaves his village and we're not really sure what's going on or where the film is heading. We know the film is about the Germans in Belarus, and while the film has shown us a few graphic images, it's careful not to get us excited. Then there's this.
Я не тут, близко.
Then there's this. Then there's this. It's the film saying, look what they did, come and see. It's not a graph, it's not stats, it's a depiction of what the Germans and their allies did. The horror that Come and See conveys would be impossible without its imagery. Opposite to that is the ironic use of graphic imagery. I'm thinking to a certain extent part of the Human Centipede series, but a more clear-cut example might be Robocop, where this scene is so preposterously gross it's funny. In a kind of way. Total Recall's iconic man meets decompression scene reflects the film. It's a satisfying demise to a man who cut off others' oxygen, but also it's not entirely serious. This ironic use of violence is also often seen in spoofs of exploitation films. Hobo with a Shotgun is a good example. Another is in The Meaning of Life, where this clip, cartoony yes but still graphic, uses gruesome imagery as part of the joke.
Oh dear, I have trodden in Monsieur's bucket.
Another bucket for Monsieur.
Nothing quite as vomit-inducing as watching other people vomit, right? So, graphic imagery is used for a variety of reasons, and as with most things, the artistic or narrative value of those reasons are on a sliding scale. The value and the power of images used really depend on the message, the context, and the tone. Some people say that graphic imagery doesn't influence people, but I completely disagree. I think 60 years ago, you could have never shown Saving Private Ryan in a cinema. I think people are desensitized to violent and sexual imagery, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think differentiating graphic imagery in terms of what's real and what's not is pretty interesting. I think that maybe a lot of people would be grossed out by some scenes in American Psycho, but I think even very blurry imagery that doesn't show any detail of people getting bombed will probably have more impact. Well, those are just my thoughts. I'd love to know what you think, and make sure you leave a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Join me next time where I will be doing a bit of a PS of a video, a bit of a footnote of a video. I'll be talking about the shock element in 2005's Feed, why the shock element didn't work, and why its failure to work made Feed one of the funniest films ever made, in my opinion. It's a video where I'll be laughing along with Feed. Kind of. See you then.
Oh my God! So much blood!
She just ate!